I'm here tonight to tell you a little bit about my story and how I started. To be quite honest, last time I told anyone the whole story, it took me 2 hours. I haven't really got time for that tonight, and Richard will certainly be doing a lot of scowling at me. So I'm going to hopefully give you something to take away with you tonight, because one thing, or rather 17 things that have stuck with me through my story, my hobbies and turning it into a business have been my principles of life and therefore how I run my business. Be passionate. I'm of course passionate about chocolate. I'm passionate about where it comes from. I never set out to create a cheap or cost-effective product. I set out to create something that was truly different and was exciting to the palate, as I hope you all have discovered. But most importantly, of course, was the raw ingredient. Even before I started making the chocolates themselves, I came across a fantastic company, a chocolate company with a difference, Callebaut, who've been absolutely supportive. And after meeting the criteria of being an absolute perfect partner for chocolate, they provide healthcare and education down to plantation level. Even in some cases, they substitute mortgages so farmers can own their own property. A perfect partner for my aims and my company. But they've been more than that. About 2 years ago, I went down on a course to their Banbury UK Academy, and Callebaut chose to sponsor me. The world's biggest chocolate manufacturer sponsored me in something, as I'm aware, have never been done before. You have helped to make me, Callebaut. Debbie, sitting over there, our sales manager. You've helped to make me more than a chocolatier than I would have been. I've had the absolute pleasure of working with some of Europe's and the UK's chocolate masters, training at the highest standards. I've done everything from advanced tempering to 2-metre chocolate sculptures that I haven't managed to get back on the train, but hopefully one day I will. But therefore, I'm passionate about my ingredient. Excuse the cue cards, by the way, I've got dyslexia and short-term memory loss. I need to prompt myself. Take risks. This is, I think, one of the most important to me, and certainly seems to define any great entrepreneur. The first risk, of course, was leaving school, the so-called safety of the education system. A decision that was ultimately left to me. I still remember the conversation sitting there with my mum and dad around the breakfast table, making the decision that would eventually change the course of my life. It was a huge risk and certainly wasn't an easy route. Spending 24 hours a day with your parents isn't exactly easy, to say the least. But of course I don't look back on the decision now. It was certainly the right one. But I think one of the biggest risks played out in the whole chocolate story, and that has allowed me to get here today, were of my mum and dad. Not only did my dad choose to leave his job to help me and help with my dream and support me, but through the story they ended up putting the house keys in the bank manager's drawers. They're still there, unfortunately. We'll get them out soon. But to absolutely support me in every way that they could. And I can't be more thankful than I am. Don't worry, Mum, I will get you that yacht. It's a long time coming, but we'll get there. Bad news is good news. I think this is the one of the most common for me, because we find ourselves in so many problems and getting bogged down by our problems and not actually learning what we should from them. There have been many examples throughout the years, but I think a fantastic example of this was early in the chocolate story. I came across the so-called fantastic idea of opening a chocolate shop. A fantastic little rural village. My cousin had just moved in across the street. I had this fantastic idea of hot chocolate drinks in the winter and cold chocolate drinks in the summer. People coming from miles around in this little bucolic village surrounded by sandstone cliffs, streams and canals. I went immediately to see the estate agent, and as I remember it quite well, we emotionally moved in within no time. We went round and had a look at the shop, this fantastic little building. We'd emotionally moved in. Mum and I were already coming up with recipes of what cakes we were going to do on which day. It was a fantastic idea, and to me almost felt like the next step for chocolate. I had a phone call a couple of days later from the estate agent saying that a couple who had actually been interested and were legally on the waiting list for the property had just got in touch. After years of nothing, they got back in touch. We were completely dismayed by this, to say the least. I think we had a bit of a teenager week that week, huffing and walking past each other, mumbling. It's a bit of a horrible thing to say that is actually teenagers. We're not that bad. Well, us unusual ones aren't anyway. But a couple of days later, when we were starting to get over it and started lessening the huffing, we had a phone call by my cousin, who of course lived right across, saying that at 3 o'clock in the morning he had one of his neighbours banging down his door, and through his sleepy days suddenly realised he was in 3 foot of water. Of course, the shop being across the road, right next to the stream and 2 foot deeper, the damage was absolutely amazing to see on a person. But I don't really like to look back on things and think if, but and when. But we could not have sustained the damage. We could not have sustained the cost, more or less anything else, apart from being very wet. But we couldn't have sustained that cost. And I wouldn't be here standing here today. So all that stress and anxiety and all that energy that we put into being completely off, we didn't need to. And I think there are so many examples of that. We put so much energy into our problems, and days later we realise that something else happens, that something changes, and we needn't have expended all that energy and annoyance and battling with each other. We didn't need to do it. Everything happens for a reason. This is one of my most live-by principles, but I think one that has happened many, many times, and I couldn't even begin to tell you all the stories. But I think a very potent one for me was something that happened recently. We were sitting down one evening watching television for once on a programme on a National Geographic filmmaking couple called Beverly and Derek Jabeur. It was an absolutely awe-inspiring programme, a couple so focused on conservation and changing the world. They followed a leopard and her cub through the African bush for 2 whole years, just to raise awareness, just to do their part. Of course, at this point, the Biting Back campaign growing in pace. I went upstairs, wrote them an email, found their website after some considerable searching, wrote them an email. A couple of days later, had an email back from Beverly, telling me how wonderful it was to hear somebody else talk about conservation and animals in the same way. Emails passed back and forwards, possibilities of working together, and they ended up flying in from South Africa a couple of weeks later to meet me in Bristol. I'm now finalising 3 bars to work with National Geographic, the biggest conservation authority in the world. So just from that little piece in the